Welcome to the first session of the day, How to Kill a Giant. I'm Branislav. I'm an engineer at Platform SH, and I'm working with Drupal 7 usually. Node.js, recurring billing is kind of the problem I'm trying to solve on a day-to-day basis. I'm a family guy, I'm a cat herder, and I have a terrible accent. Which is consequence of the fact that I was born in this country, to a mother from that country and father combined from those two countries, and the country kind of dispersed, exploded into multiple countries, everyone having its own language. I remained in Serbia, which is that country, until I moved to Germany and started working for an English-speaking yet French company with people from all around the world. So yeah, that's why I love my terrible accent. There's everything in there. So, and let's talk about kind of scenario where you have an idea for a startup. So you want to build whatever as a service because that's popular these days, and we can make a lot of money on whatever as a service. You are PHP programmers, of course. Who here is not a programmer? Okay, that's good. And you have free choice of tech stack, but you have one important limitation. That is, you want to reduce your risks. So you want, shortest possible time to market, right? And because we are in a cutthroat industry, and that's how it is done. So let's talk about technology. Which language would you use? Which framework would you use? Which architecture would you use? Would you use something that you are familiar with, or something that is the best possible technology for the given project, even if you are not familiar with it at all? Ideas?
Depends on how much money the client has.
No, you are the client. It's your project. It's your project. It's your disruptive industry thing or whatever.
If I'm trying to get to market as fast as possible, probably my language.
My language and my framework. In this particular case, Drupal 8, I guess, or even Drupal 7. I mean, I still have more experience with Drupal 7 than Drupal 8. But if I had enough time and wanted to build it right, I would make choices that are like 2019 choices. I would use something decoupled. I would use something Reacty and GraphQL thingies. They're popular things, right? And I want to build something for the future. But sad reality of most of our projects is our brownfield projects. So you are working on something that somebody else designed like 10 years ago. So who works here on a big brownfield project designed by somebody else? Yeah, it's terrible. So
mine's way worse than that.
So, and really, when you're thinking about architecture of like 10 years ago, that's Drupal 7. Drupal 7 was cutting edge then, and it was a good choice because Drupal 7 actually gives you a lot of power, and it was the first CMS that was not really a CMS. It was a framework for whatever. You would choose monolithic architecture because monoliths are much easier to manage than whatever else service-oriented thing we had there. And you would use tightly coupled frontend for two reasons. First of them, decoupled frontend was not invented yet, and second, more important one, you really wanted, because we're talking about the time when people were full stack developers. So you would do your own front end and also PHP backends, etc. So just imagine the situation that 8 years later or 10 years later, the business succeeded. You have heaps of accumulated knowledge. You have a team that you built on this old and monolithic project, right? That team has it has its own idiosyncrasies. People grew as programmers. They started 8 years ago and they didn't know anything, and now they know the thing really well, and you have a lot of customers, and you have a growth, which actually introduces some problems. So first problem is, because you started to build fast, you didn't really think about the future, you accumulated technical debt, and that's something normal, and that's something expected. But then somebody decided that Drupal 7 is going to die, and it's going to die in November 2021. So now you need to think for the future. Now, for small projects, November 2021 is actually pretty solid deadline. 2 years, but not enough. For big projects, we're having problems. But let's talk about technical debt. So Drupal 7 is inviting you to build up the technical debt, because it has hook system, and hook system is awesome, and hook system is powerful, but hook system sooner or later is going to change your state, like from the loading to in the database to using it somewhere up there in modules. It's going to change the state so much that every single debugging is nightmare, as everybody of you already know that. You have a lot of mishmashed, mutually dependent code, and it just looks terrible. And finally, you started your project keeping your config in the database, and then you learned, throughout the years that was a terrible decision, and then you wanted to move your config into code base, and somebody invented features, which is module not initially built to do that kind of thing, but we kind of started using it, and then you figure out, okay, if features created modules for me, I can edit those modules to add logic into it, and then combine logic, config, etc. in a single code thingy, and it would look terrible. And the consequences of that accumulated debt are terrible as well. So the biggest problem is the fact that every single new developer you bring in is going to be miserable, because onboarding is going to be slow and painful, and whatever they try to do, it's going to produce some errors. So regressions are going to be super fast, super frequent, and the entire team's velocity is going to be reduced, and it's all going to look like game of Mikado, where you need to pull the stick without collapsing the entire structure, right? And this is really well explained in the design stamina hypothesis, described in Martin Fowler's article in 2007, which basically means that you're starting a new project, and that's usually this green line, this blue line. You really do not think about design. You're thinking about just time to market, and you have amazing velocity if you're not designing things in the beginning. But you're going to start losing velocity, and finally you're going to end up in this vicious circle of just fighting against your own technical debt. If you designed it in the beginning, things would be really slow at the beginning, but you wouldn't lose velocity along the way. So nobody's really thinking about design payoff line, which happens sometimes in the future. Because you're not really sure if your project is going to succeed. And this is the blue pill is the one we take each day. And then we end up in a zone where our project succeeded. Now we have an idea that our no design approach was wrong, and we need to change something. It's time to replace the giant. Who here has a project that is in kind of this phase? So our giant is Drupal 7 or Drupal 6 project, right? Usually. So what is the Drupal way of updating to Drupal 8? You're going to build a new version of Drupal 8. You're going to write the migration scripts. You're going to run the migrations, whether you're going to shut down the old site for a day, maybe, and then run the migrations, and then just reroute the traffic to the new site, or you're going to, without shutting it down, somehow live migrate things. That's your decision. And Drupal 8 works perfectly for small projects, for corporate projects, for blogs, etc. It does not work well on giants, because if you're having a giant, you cannot really redevelop it from the scratch. It's too big. And even if you try to redevelop it from the scratch, you would probably copy the same mistakes you did in the old version of the software, and you would end up with the same thing you had. And if your site requires a downtime and you're having a startup that makes money only when it's up, you lose clients and everything would be terrible. So that's a problem with the giants. There's also a problem with humans. We are bad at planning. We plan bad, we execute big plans poorly, and we tend to cut corners, right? And we usually have a problem to explain to our managers that our project is going to stop for the next 2 years because we are redeveloping the entire thing in a new framework without any new features, just redeveloping the thing. And also, the bigger the project, the bigger the thing we need to deploy, more chances of error are there. And there is another graph that's absolutely awesome, and it shows precisely that. If you're waiting a long time before the deployment, and really only deployment increases the value of your product, then you're having the big risk of that single huge deployment. If you are deploying new projects in a gradual way, in agile way, you're reducing the risk, and that's good. And that's really, essentially the foundation of all the agile methodologies. So our question here right now is, how can we redevelop and replace a giant in an agile way, thus minimizing the expenses and risk? And one of the solutions is the Strangler application pattern. Who knows about it? Strangler pattern. So it was first described by Martin Fowler in 2004, and he described it as a new system gradually built around the edges of an old system, and then it would basically strangle the old system and until it renders it obsolete and useless, and it would continue living while the old system died. And the idea was inspired by Strangler figs of Australia and Queensland, where those figs are slowly rooting themselves around the host tree and then start growing and then start strangling the tree until the host tree is actually dead, and then the beautiful thing remains. This is Kyle Brown, who in 2017 describes 3 steps of the Strangler pattern. First one is transform, create a new parallel website. Second one is coexist, slowly move features from the old site to the new website while keeping the both. Finally, when the old site becomes totally useless, just eliminate it entirely. And Michael Rook in 2016 writes that in more details about the Strangler pattern, and basically he describes it at first. You add a proxy between the user and your application. Then add new service and move one feature or one page of the old service into a new service. Then just rewire the proxy to reroute all the traffic to this new path, new feature, to the new site. As you're adding more pages, you're rerouting more and more until finally the old monolith does not serve anything anymore, and then you can just shut it down. Or graphically represented. That's it. So first you have a client and the monolith. And then you're just squeezing in the proxy. Nothing else. You start building features, a service, and once you're done, the proxy is going to reroute the traffic to that service. Now the question about proxy, is it something complicated? What do you think? What is the proxy? It can be a patch, if nothing else.
Yeah.
It can be a single HTXS file. It can be, whatever, Nginx. If you're crazy, you can use AJ Proxy. Who cares? Basically, you have just, if I stumble upon this feature, go to new service. Otherwise, go to the next service. That's it. Done. Your proxy is done. And this allows you to slowly build one service at a time and reduce the size of the monolith until the monolith is so small and slow to useless and does not serve any traffic, and then you can just simply delete it. When will this work?
I have a question.
Yes.
About this. If you're, I'm thinking about this in terms of Drupal, specific.
Yeah.
So if we have a Drupal 7 site that we want to get rid of, but the destination has to be Drupal 8, does this paradigm hold?
It holds. It holds as long as you, well, these are kind of conditions right here. So, under condition that your URL structure is going to remain the same. So, path to a feature, /blog is going to remain /blog. It's not going to /blogs or something. It holds. It holds as long as your design is not going to change in the new website, because you're going to have this visual discrepancy between those two. It will work if, of course, if you're building a web application, which is Drupal by default. It will not work for mobile applications. But then again, your question is also migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. Now, if you're having a giant project, do you really want to replace it with a new giant? That's kind of, if you're building small or medium-sized projects, Drupal 8 is going to hold. But, you don't really want to replace one monolith with another because, sooner or later, you're going to update Drupal 9, 10, 11, 12. And you're still going to have the same problem. So this will kind of work more or better with service-oriented architecture or microservices or something like that. But really, the advantages is zero downtime, absolute zero. And because you're frequently releasing, you are reducing the risks of failure. And if you fail, you want to fail in the beginning of the project, not in the end. And of course, because dev team now thinks about a single encapsulated feature, single domain, call it. It is going to be a lesser cognitive load. They don't have to think about the whole. And because you are actually splitting the project into multiple minor things, minor services or domains, you can have multiple independent development teams. Because the only thing they need to agree upon is routing, nothing else. And once you're doing that, once you're actually creating microservices or something, then you can think even about various tech stack for various things you're developing. And that opens a totally new world of possibilities. First one being data-driven refactoring. Now, think about this. Do you know how your clients are using your application? And how difficult it is, especially for Drupal 7, to understand what do your clients do with your application. If they are stumbling upon some looks or confusing parts of your application, etc., etc. What do you want to prioritize? Where are the bottlenecks of your current application? Those are the problems you want to address or find answers to before you start the entire refactoring project. So why not this? Introduce the proxy and then just feed the usage data for your application from proxy to somewhere. That can be an Elk stack, that can be whatever. And then you're building slowly reports. And after some time, you're going to know which pages are responsive, which not. How do users use your application? What is important and what is totally unimportant for them. And then you can direct your refactoring. Another thing you can do is decoupled frontend. And that's something that everybody talks about for the last 2 years. And really, think about this. You want to update your front ends, user experience, and you want to use the Strangler pattern, which is kind of incompatible in the beginning, right? But what if you first developed decoupled frontend in front of your old monolithic application, and then slowly started replacing the monolith with something else? It would work like this. So first step would be to develop RESTful API in your monolith. And with Drupal 7, that's super simple. So you have a choice of RESTful or services module. You can document your thing with Swagger, and then you can just, API, and then you can just propagate this Swagger file or Open API free file to the proxy itself. And then the proxy becomes API proxy, and it also becomes an aggregated documentation thing. Why is that important? Well, you're going to allow then a totally different team, decoupled team, to do only decoupled frontend development. The only thing they relate to is Open API documentation. They have no idea what's happening underneath in your monolith. You're slowly killing the monolith, replacing it with various API-driven headless things. Nobody knows about it. And you have, what's really sweet about this pattern is users are seeing changes immediately. Your stakeholders are happy, management is super happy, everybody's happy. Now you have the proxy, right? And the proxy already started doing things. Now it's a little bit smarter than before because it has to keep, it has to maintain the API documentation. But just imagine that you started building microservices. Every single microservice is doing, it's having its own language of communication because not all services are the same, not all teams are the same. You want to ensure that the proxy kind of translates from a common language of communication with clients to different languages of communication between microservices. Now you can, for example, introduce GraphQL as a protocol for communication between your front end and the proxy, and proxy would then translate GraphQL to whatever, GraphQL, REST, SOAP API, auth server. Proxy then remains the only point of defining the language of communication with clients. And that's pretty interesting. And finally, Sam Newman, in his book, Building Microservices, who read the book? It's awesome, really. It's like the essential book for domain-driven development. Says that now that you have microservices are basically going to allow you to choose the right tool for a job. And in our case, let's say we have decoupled front-end and proxy, and then we have authentication, billing, big data, and content management. We want to treat as separate services, separate domains in our application. And then we can do authentication in Go language because Go is fun and we want to learn it, even though we don't know it, and it has kind of interesting libraries. Because Commerce 2 is absolutely awesome. We want to do all the billing with Commerce 2. PHP is useless for big data. So if we want to do big data, we are going to do it with Python, of course. And if we want to do content management, Drupal 8 is the best tool for content management ever. So let's do that. And let's treat Drupal 8 as one service and Drupal Commerce as another service. And those two are actually microservices totally separate. Why is that important? Because we want to scale the application horizontally. We already grew. We already know that one Drupal is not going to be enough for us.
Wouldn't authentication, though, would that live between the proxy and your services? How do you treat authentication across your services?
It's OAuth 2 token. So basically, what's the basic idea of this? And this is something I'm going to talk about in next slides.
Okay.
So I don't want to really run into, but basically, authentication OAuth 2 token, and then you use that token to communicate with other services. Service is going to validate it, and that's it. But this is a practical example, right? Platform SH, and this is something we are actually doing at Platform SH for the last 2 years. So at Platform SH, you have a user who communicates with Drupal monolith. We call Drupal monolith accounts. And then we have various regions where we actually host your projects. Each region exposes an API. It also exposes a UI. Drupal 7 also exposes both API and UI, but it's a separate service. Now, the idea is we currently use Drupal 7 for a lot of things. Two interesting things for here is authorization, which is basically open, OAuth authorization, where we receive the token to use to consume in API calls or whatever. So now I want to do something to my project. I want to see how my project is configured, but I don't really know where my project is. Is it in EU region or US region? The authority for project discovery is Drupal 7 monolith. So I am asking the Drupal 7, where's my project? And Drupal 7 is going to respond, it's in the US. Then I'm going to ask for US region to actually tell me where's my, to show me information about my project. Drupal US region is going to ask the Drupal if I'm legit. Drupal is going to say yeah, and I'm going to receive my thing. Why is this important? So first I need to authorize, which is kind of logical. Then I have this totally useless step, where's my project? I should talk to a single service that should just return my project, because that's how it should work. And then I'm talking to another service which does the thing. And really, we are maintaining front end for each of these services. So we have Angular for our regions. We have Drupal team, standard team in Drupal 7 monolith. And that is really a problem when you think about consistency of user experience. And authentication in general is a big problem, because I cannot really run deployments of Drupal 7 whenever I want, because once the Drupal 7 is down, the entire authentication project stack is down. And yeah, as I said, this is absolutely useless step. I do not want to ask anybody about where my project is. It should be automated. So let's introduce the API proxy. First, now I'm having only, if I'm consuming this as an API, I'm having only one URL to talk to, which is api.platform.sh. I'm authorizing with Drupal 7 monolith because it is still an authentication layer. I'm talking to API proxy, show me my project. API proxy is first going to ask Drupal 7, where's the project? And then it's going to talk directly to the region and finally prepare a response. That's simple for me as a consumer. But it also allows us to stop caring about the front end in our regions, to stop caring about the front end of our Drupal 7 monolith. Well, mostly, they still need to authenticate, they still need to use user login form. API proxy is by default headless, and I'm having decoupled frontend to be maintained by a separate team. Now I have total decoupling of front-end and back-end teams. Or to represent this in another way, Drupal frontend, decoupled frontend talks to API proxy, which then talks to various services we already have. Why is this important? Because we can add a new service. So first service we are adding is OAuth to server, which actually totally removes the need to authenticate with Drupal and gives me ability to deploy my Drupal 7 whenever I want. That's already a huge benefit for me as a developer and users who are receiving more stable product. But then I can start, outsource the project discovery service from Drupal. And I can outsource billing service from Drupal. And basically that means that Drupal 7 monolith can be retired as obsolete, and I can build services however I want. So my regions are already in Python. OAuth is going to be written in Go. Project discovery service is a simple thing. It's just really simple read optimized database, so write it in Symfony. Billing service can be done with Drupal Commerce because I already got all the tools with it. But API proxy can now be written in Go, for example, because Go is cool and efficient, and because it's a stateless application, sort of stateless application. I'm building cache in API proxy, and I want to keep it the only state, so easy to rebuild the state. I can horizontally scale it. I can even geographically load balance it, so I can have multiple API proxies in every single continent, other than Antarctica, in the world. So, and that would already make the application faster, much faster to the end user. It sounds awesome, but it's not. There's a lot of agony involved. So if you do not have a big enough team, a team big enough to sustain this craziness, you will hurt. If you diversify your technology beyond the abilities of your team, you're also going to hurt. You're going to hurt real bad if you design this badly and you make a distributed monolith. What does that really mean? That means that if any of your components, well, a single component of your thing dies and your entire service dies, you are in the wrong place. You're in a bad place. So you don't want this. And you will also hurt if you do not monitor your services. So your services should be built with an error in mind. If a service dies, that should be an expected thing. And then that service should be easily rebooted again without disrupting the overall application. And for that you need quality monitoring. And really you need, because now we are talking about a lot of containers and this thing scales horizontally beautifully, you need quality DevOps. You can decide whether you want to hire DevOps or you want to outsource DevOps. And one of the company you can outsource to is Platform SH, and we are doing DevOps pretty good. If you're building an application that's super difficult to deploy, if you don't have good CI/CD workflows, you will hurt. And talking about CI/CD, if you want to hear more about CI/CD, I'm going to have a session dedicated to that today afternoon. So yeah, whatever you do, you will hurt because microservices are complicated. They're super risky, and our job here is only to minimize the risk. Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments or Rotten Tomatoes? I'm happy to talk about this. Yes?
It seems like given that you have a Drupal 7 monolith already, that it's kind of hard to separate out what the different services would be. Is there because if you have different sets of features, for example, and you don't necessarily have a consistent URL structure, is it even possible to split out the services?
It is if you decide to take this route. So basically you are developing a decoupled frontend first, and then you don't really care about routes anymore because you already kind of redesigned the entire API. Now it becomes API driven, it becomes decoupled, as long as you're keeping the API signature or interface the same. Basically then we are talking about removing API endpoints to various services. It is a big job to decide what goes where. That's totally new topic of this problem. More questions, comments?
To answer that question, when you're moving out, for example, that Drupal 7 monolith, where, for example, authentication was following a specific address pattern and URIs, you have at some point some action that every team needs to take at the same time. For example, moving the decoupled frontend from Drupal.platform message to host.platform message. At some point, you can't do that fully transparently. When you put that API proxy, you need to have all your team synchronized to do that change at the same time.
And that's once. Did you say that's?
Yeah.
That's once.
That's the first thing
Yeah,
you do is
exactly.
the decoupling.
That's
once.
only one time if you do it well.
Of course.
If you do that as generic as possible, yeah, this is only one time. In our case,
Well,
we had some changes.
so basically, yes, the idea of programming is right. Programming is nothing more than directed learning. When we started this project, we did not really have any idea. We had idea where do we want to go. We did not really have an idea what to do. And okay, we had this Strangler Pattern as kind of guidelines, but it's not really, it's not the playbook. So yeah, we made mistakes. That's perfectly fine. And good thing is, if you are making these tiny atomic changes, those mistakes are really, they're not big. We can live with it.
And something we're not good at right now is basically, even if the OS server is separated from Drupal, our user base is also in Drupal, because we need to track commerce and bidding and things like this. So basically, we have two places that we need to keep in sync for authorization. And that's bad. That needs to change, but this is a big thing. When you're moving out of Drupal, the structure of Drupal, the entities, the objects, and the weights also in the database is really hard to just click over and say to Drupal, okay, you don't need to have your user in your own table. You could look at that server. You know how that works now. So right now we've got some synchronization in place, and that's sometimes fun.
It's all part of beauty of this job. Yes?
What if you're, for example, we're using SAML-based authentication out of and right now all of our SAML-based authentication is going through Drupal. So for an authentication layer, would we need to rebuild the authentication layer in another service in the paradigm that you've listed?
Well, you wouldn't need it, but you would want it. Because the SAML also has this problem of it needs to keep Drupal up in order for other services to authenticate, right? They need to validate your tokens. If you're doing something like JWT tokens and OAuth, it would be kind of easier because your Drupal can go down and JWT tokens are still legit without even having to talk back to the authentication system. But I believe SAML does not function like that. It needs authentication system to be up.
It does. I need to authenticate it because it's dependent on SSL that lives on both source and on the server, on the single sign-on end, and on the recipient.
Yeah, that is a problem, right? So basically, you do want, especially if and our idea was precisely that. We cannot perform any surgery on Drupal without really jeopardizing authentication, which is really jeopardizing the entire company, right? Functioning of the entire company. So therefore, our idea was to make a first service authentication. Authentication is really, it's a little bit tricky because you need to maintain state. So you need to build it really right in order for the state to be, safe. And here also because I believe decision for OAuth was made precisely for that reason. So we are going to be sending JWT encoded tokens just for that reason, so that even if authentication system dies for any reason, it'll still be up for most of the users, service only structures.
And I guess it would be generally bad to rely on Drupal for your authentication service.
Precisely. Drupal.
It's kind of slow.
Yeah.
For that purpose.
Yeah. That's the thing with Drupal. We built it to do so many things, and then we're having problems. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for attending the session.